All right, well, I think we'll get started here. Good morning, everybody. Like I said earlier, beautiful day for a webinar. Um, so this morning we're going to be talking about using plants in different parts of your landscape for habitat and food source and all different types of things for birds. We're really fortunate to have Doug here from the Audubon Society and Sacajawea Audubon Society, and they've worked with us a couple times before where we've been able to educate our staff in particular on making recommendations that are really good for supporting the bird population here in town. So I'm not going to go into too much more, but thanks again for joining. We will be keeping you guys muted and your video off during the presentation. And then at the end, we're going to do a Q&A, and we'll invite you to unmute. And then also, if you pay attention down in the chat box, I will be posting links in the background here as Doug goes through his presentation. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to you, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I'm going to get this shared on everybody's screen. Okay.
Yeah, I think if you just go start from the first slideshow.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Great. Well, before I begin, I just wanted to thank Emily and Cashman Nursery for hosting this event. And I wanted to thank Sacajawea Audubon as well for providing some of the content in this presentation. Um, the Oh, I just lost my, anyways. Let's get started. Thanks for coming to Landscaping for Birds. These are a few of the examples that can be brought into our yards. And for those who may be unfamiliar with some of them, there's a calliope hummingbird down in the bottom part of your screen. Up on the upper right-hand side is a Lasley bunting. They are just a stunning bird that will come into the Story Mill area, Bozeman Creek. They'll stage in Bozeman in the spring before they head up into the hillsides to nest. Probably the top two reasons why I really enjoy landscaping for birds is one, I just love birds. I just think they're an amazing thing to bring into your yard. They bring so much life and activity and sounds, and it's just such a wonderful addition to have into your yard. But the second reason is our bird populations are in crisis. And I want to do anything that I can do to help, and I hope you'll join me in that effort. In 2019, there was a study that was published by Science Magazine, and it was the first population assessment done in the US as well as Canada on our bird populations. And the results were actually incredibly startling and stunning. 2.9 billion breeding adult birds have been lost since 1970. They recorded steep declines in every biome. 1 billion forest birds were lost, and 90% of that loss occurred when basically 2.5 billion of those birds are beloved sparrows, finches, blackbirds, and warblers. So what can we do? Well, there's two main avenues that we can use to assist birds. One is through conservation, and conservation is going to help those birds that we can't bring into our yards. Birds like western meadowlarks, which is our state bird, savanna sparrows, mountain bluebirds. These guys won't be coming into our yards, so we have to use our conservation efforts to help them. The second avenue is through habitat restoration and replication. And that's what we're going to be mainly discussing today in landscaping for birds. This is an aerial view of the Bozeman area, and as you can see, it has doubled in the last 30 years, and it's continuing to grow. And with that, we're going to get some habitat loss. But what I like about this slide is it really shows the legacy of our forefathers. We have some wonderful legacy trees in downtown Bozeman, including both conifers and deciduous trees. And what we're going to be talking about today is continuing that legacy, getting our legacy trees planted in the outer areas of the Bozeman area as well as into the county. One book that I actually wanted to highlight as well, if you're not familiar with it, is Nature's Best Hope. And it's written by a professor out of the University of Delaware named Douglas Ptolemy. And he has this thing that he calls the new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. And it's about linking all of our yards together to create nurturing habitat for nature in general and birds as well, that will help mitigate some of that habitat loss. Birds are adaptable, and we want to basically take plants that we're finding in our montane, transition, and riparian areas and bring them into our yards so that we can attract birds like the downy woodpecker, the dark-eyed junco, the chipping sparrow, western tanager, or black-capped chickadee, and even mountain chickadees as well. We'd like to rebuild the ecosystem services in our landscapes. The landscape that you're looking at in the upper left-hand side is a sterile environment. It's not providing anything for nature. It's not producing insects, and birds obviously are not going to be coming into that environment. What we want to move towards is the landscape on the right-hand side. This is a backyard in Missoula that has done a wonderful job of creating a densely planted, nurturing environment and insect producing environment as well for our birds. We can bring in birds like the calliope hummingbird. We can bring in gleaners like a yellow warbler. And in the case of the owls, these were two of the three fledglings that I had drop into my backyard about 3 years ago, just outside of town. But we had an environment that was welcoming enough for them that they scooted out to my yard after being flushed out of their nesting area. I'm going to let this slide marinate for a little bit. This is really what it's all about, the keys to landscaping for birds. Essentially, what we're doing is we're providing the birds' basic needs of food, water, cover, and nesting sites. And we're doing that through thoughtful landscape design, building habitat layers, providing density, variety, and focusing on native plants. I like this slide because if you live outside of town, you're living in a newer development, and so you don't have the advantage of our beautiful legacy trees. But this provides three of the four really important elements. And the other thing about it is this kind of environment will be a good transition until you do get your legacy trees up to maturity. So what do we mean by planting with layers? Well, we're going to create an overstory. These are the legacy trees that I was talking about. These are the big conifer and deciduous trees that we see in downtown Bozeman. The mid-story canopy, the slide that I just showed, aspen trees, mountain ash, larger shrubs like the serviceberry, and then an understory where we have our perennials and smaller shrubs. And then the ground and leaf layer, which is also an important layer for the larvae and insects to regenerate. I'm highlighting some of our conifers and upper canopy trees because they will provide an increased biodiversity that you may not get with the other layers. But it doesn't mean that you can't go ahead and plant whatever layers you can get into your newer environment. What the big upper canopy trees will bring in is they're going to bring in this northern saw-whet owl, which I took, or actually Scott and Lori Lawson took this picture a month ago in their backyard. This male red crossbill, these guys are nomadic seed eaters that will come into our conifers and harvest the seeds. He's kind of showing off his specialized set of pliers in his beak to extract those seeds. Sunset Cemetery is a good place to take a look at these crossbills. And I actually took this picture in a friend's backyard last spring. One of the trees that isn't necessarily an upper canopy tree is our Rocky Mountain juniper, but I wanted to highlight that as well because it's such an important tree in our, it's really a keystone species in our drier environments. Density and variety are also key elements. This is in the lower right-hand side again, this is the yard in Missoula. And you can see how they've planted in groupings. The goldenrod here, we've got some fleabane, and then it looks like some wild bergamot or bee balm in the areas as well. This provides both cover for the birds as well as additional food. So this is a very effective way of planting your plants. The landscape on the upper left-hand side is a nice landscape, and they've got a really nice start here. They sort of have the business in the front and the party in the back, kind of the mullet design. But one of the things they could do is group the Gaillardia together a little bit and some of the other plants to provide a little bit more cover, particularly for the ground feeding sparrows and maybe even the towhees if they could bring those in. We want to focus on native plants because that's the way to increase our carrying capacity in our yards, particularly if we have small yards. The more we can get those insect producers going, the better. The other reason to focus in on native plants is they're hardy to our climate. They're adapted. And the birds are adapted to our native plants, meaning that the timing of their nesting and migrations are completely adapted and set towards our native plants. Plant choice matters, and this is an Eastern example of how you can increase your carrying capacity with your native plants. Back east, oaks are one of the big caterpillar producers. And as you can see, the difference is stunning. 557 species of caterpillars in a native oak tree, as opposed to 5 species of caterpillars by this ginkgo. This was a study done by Doug Ptolemy's PhD students. And they had a related study as well, where they looked at chickadees, nesting chickadees. And what they found was if you drop below a ratio of 70% natives and 30% non-natives, the ability for nesting birds to sustain themselves in that environment drops significantly. Obviously, there's a lot of variables in that, but I think the lesson to learn and to take from this is be very thoughtful in your plant choices and try to increase that carrying capacity as much as you can. So the basic needs that birds need are food. This includes berries, fruit, nectar, and seeds, but most importantly, it's insects. Nearly all songbirds raise their young on insects, so welcome those insects into your yard. One of the more maybe under appreciated aspects of a landscape is the cover that it provides for birds, both in terms of our predators as well as our little guys. Directly related to the cover is the nesting sites that cover provides for our bird populations. And then finally, to kind of the icing on the cake, is add water. Insects are the foundation of life. One of the things that I love about this photo of the waxwings, these are cedar waxwings, is their reverence for this. And the male is actually presenting this insect to the female in a courting dance. And what's cool about this is they do this little dance where the female will take the insect, she'll do 3 hops away from the male bird, and then 3 hops back towards the male and give the insect back to the male. The male will do 3 hops away from the female and then 3 hops back. And they'll continue this little dance. This one lasted probably 12 to 14 or 12 to 15 times of handoff. I didn't know if the insect disintegrated or if they just tired, but it's just an amazing sight to see. The other picture is just a female tree swallow bringing in a face full of insects for its nestlings. And this was just a nest box that I had in my front yard for a number of years. Most importantly, songbirds need caterpillars. Nestlings, birds are at their most vulnerable at their earliest stages, and particularly the small guys. The sooner we can get them into their fledgling stage, the better in terms of the survival rate. And the best way to do that is with a high protein source like a caterpillar that's also soft, that the adult birds can stuff down the nestling's throat to get it to grow as quickly as possible. These numbers give you a sense of how much work needs to be done by these adults that get these protein-rich food sources into their babies. Some of the species that are really good insect producers are quaking aspens. We've got 2 food sources that the aspen provides, both the catkins, which you can see in the back here with this western tanager, as well as the insects that gleaners will come in, like kinglets and warblers, gleaning the insects off of the tree branches. Another good one is the paper birch, and this is an example of where a non-native does a really good job of providing the ecosystem services that a native tree will provide as well. Nectar is another food source that's going to be important. The birds that you'll be able to bring into your yard with nectar is essentially hummingbirds. We have 4 varieties. We've got the calliope, the rufous, the broad-tailed, and then even sometimes we get black chins in our area. Wild bergamot and bee balm are great plants to bring into your yard. If you do a combination of both the wild bergamot, which is native, and the cultivar, you can extend your feeding season a little bit as well. The golden currant is a really important early season one for nectar feeders. And the dotted gayfeather not only brings in hummingbirds, but is a great pollinator as well. The firecracker penstemon is kind of a renowned hummingbird attractor. And I don't have much experience with the honeysuckle vine, but that also is a good hummingbird attractor as well. This is a picture that was taken locally by Dan Ellison, and it's a picture of a juniper or a juvenile cedar waxwing doing a little yoga while it's grabbing breakfast. Some of the species that are really important, we've got actually a lot of both native and non-native fruit producers that are excellent, but the ones that I'd like to highlight is the serviceberry. Everything eats this. Really, really good plant to have in your yard. And if you don't want a large serviceberry, the Saskatoon, you can go with a Regent cultivar, which is probably a little bit more easier to maintain in a small yard. The Rhodosier dogwood, wonderful winter interest, just a beautiful dense shrub. It does spread. It takes a little bit more management in that area, but it offers some great berries. And I had a few of these in my old yard, and I also had house finches and robins nesting in this shrub as well. So that's another good choice. Mountain ash is my favorite tree, and it's a wonderful one that you can bring into your yards. It also makes an interesting boulevard tree, at least in my opinion. Um, they're renowned for getting stripped. Flocks of cedar waxwings and bohemian. This is a bohemian right here, and you can tell by its gray breast. That's one of the differentiating factors of a bohemian from a cedar. But they'll come in and just strip these trees in minutes. But a wonderful tree. And the reason why I have a Wilson's warbler here is I had a mountain ash planted in front of my TV room at our old house. And I would just love to watch the gleaners come in, particularly in the fall. These Wilson warblers would come in and glean the insects off the branches. These are some great choices for seed producers, mid to late summer and fall. We've got some purple coneflower, the echinaceas. The coneflowers are excellent, as well as the blanket flowers. The showy goldeneye is not a native, but it's a great choice for dry environments as well. And I've included this picture of a juvenile white-crowned sparrow on coneflowers that are dead because one of the things that you can do is keep your plants up through the late fall and winter because they can provide an additional food source for birds during those hard times in terms of food production. One of the flowers we want to highlight is the Maximilian sunflower, which isn't particularly native to Bozeman, but it's a prairie native, and it does well in this environment, and it also produces a ton of seeds. So that also can be a good choice for you in your landscaping. As I mentioned, cover may be the most underrated element in your landscaping. It's critical to have the birds stay. You could put a lot of food producing plants in your yard, but if you don't have the cover, then you won't be able to sustain them. They'll essentially do little drive-bys, but they aren't going to stay in your yard and they won't nest. This picture is a chipping sparrow nest that was taken in a really dense kind of mid-canopy environment. And the cover also is important for our predators as well. This is one of the juvenile great horned owls in my backyard, and you can see the magpie actually was coming up from the grasses to mob this little guy. Nest sites. I included pictures of the yellow warbler and this flycatcher to also kind of highlight the relationships between native plants and birds. Both of these guys are using cottonwood seeds in their nests. As well as, don't forget to, if you have some dead trees, at least leave a portion of the dead tree up. It's not only a great area for nesting for birds like flickers and other cavity nesters, but it's a great insect producer. And chickadees will use these cavities. They use abandoned cavities in the wintertime. They'll huddle up in these little cavities to survive the real cold temperatures in winter. To kind of put the icing on the cake and supplement your landscaping for birds, we absolutely need water. These gray partridges were coming into this watering site every day. One thing that I would suggest is if you can elevate your watering site, particularly if you live in downtown Bozeman, just to protect the birds from cats, as well as predators if you live outside of town. Nest boxes are also great. house wrens are a real common occupant of these guys, and tree swallows can be incredibly entertaining as well. This was taken in my front yard for a number of years. Cashman was generous enough to provide some really nice designs, and we'll have links to this brochure. But what I like about it too is it shows that you don't have to do your whole yard. We can do little spaces. You can cut off a corner and just do some yard reduction or lawn reduction to provide these little pockets of habitat for birds. Um, if you want to go a little bit bigger, you could do a biohedge that could be a nice screening thing or border for your between you and your neighbors. This is a really nice example using a lot of natives as well as some non-natives to create that effect. And then if you have a larger yard, you could maybe do a little lawn reduction with an island bed. That's another really good example. And so again, we'll have these links at the end of the presentation. This is a privacy screen. And again, just showing that we don't need a big space to provide these little corridors of habitat. I believe this is only 4 or 5 feet wide, and they've done a nice job of offering some nice lower canopy shrubs as well as some catmints in here, which is not native, but it's actually a great pollinator attractor as well. As I mentioned, any kind of corridors, you could use little side yards. We've got some conifers in here as well as some aspens and red cherry, the Canada red cherry, with some shrubs underneath to provide a little corridor of feeding areas for birds. This is a new biohedge in progress, showing some of the real common plants in our area. The elderberry is one that I have not mentioned, but that is a really good fruit producer as well. And then some of the little guys, the penstemons, are pretty commonly known to attract hummingbirds, but columbine will do that as well. So nice choice of plants in here. The lilacs are good for the gleaners as well. This is the biohedge finished off, and it actually looks like they put a fruiting tree in there as well. Thrushes, vireos are really good. They'll come in the fall, and they love the fruiting shrubs. This is an example I wanted to provide just as a water-wise example. It is something that the city is concentrating on, so this might be an option for some of you as well. This homeowner has done a really nice job of planting some coneflowers and gaillardias in the yard, but what we could do to increase the bird friendliness of this, it looks like they've got a pine in the back, so they've got at least a mid-story and maybe an upper canopy plant, but we could add some Rocky Mountain junipers in here, add a little bit more winter food. Buffalo berry is a great drought tolerant shrub that I've not mentioned yet, but they have a red berry that birds enjoy in the fall as well. Rabbit brush is a native that is a good pollinator attractor. And it also provides some nice winter interest as well. And then to kick in the variety, we could add a little Shelly goldeneye, which I mentioned is a really good drought tolerant seed producer. If we add an elevated bird bath into this, we've got it all complete, and it would really be quite a nice environment for birds in a dry area. So to sum up again, we're basically taking care of the bird's basic needs of food, water, cover, and nesting sites. And we're doing that through thoughtful landscape design that includes habitat layers, density, variety, and native plants. Thank you for your interest in this. I hope you'll join me in landscaping for birds, and so that we can provide the connectivity that will really provide some great habitat for our local bird populations. Thanks again, and we'll move to our question and answer period.
All right. If you guys have questions, I'm just going to say go ahead and type your name in the chat box, and then we'll call on you to unmute yourself so that you can chat with us. Okay. I'm also going to post a link here. So the city of Bozeman has a WaterWise plant rebate program. So if you get your water from the city of Bozeman, they have a $100 to $200 drought tolerant plant rebate program. So I'm just going to put the link in here for that. Okay. All right, let's see here. All right, so Bruce, go ahead. You're still muted.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, one of the sort of a comment that I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on is I love the bird habitat, but we're also getting so much messaging around, particularly those of us that live out in the forest fringe area, being told to cut down anything that's flammable for fire safety. So unfortunately, we're getting conflicting, which isn't good for the birds. And I don't know much, it's just something I guess we have to balance. But I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on that. If there's a bird-friendly and fire-resistant approach to this.
That's that's a really good question.
I mean,
and I think
go ahead.
One thought that I had is if you do need to cut back and or push trees and shrubs out away from your house, is to do it in the wintertime. I think the impact will at least be minimized to some extent. Again, if you can make careful observations in your yard and kind of see what's going on in terms of where birds are, where they're using the trees and shrubs for the cover, and try to leave those if you can. And then, be careful what time of year you make those adjustments, particularly to protect nesting birds in the spring and early summer. So do you have any thoughts, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the situation where, it's just trying to find a balance. If you have, your fire, there's a certain amount of space away from the building envelope that's recommended for planting certain things and keeping that clear, not having certain grasses up near the house and not having certain trees within a certain envelope. So kind of balancing what you can have, and if that's the case, okay, and you plant window baskets every year, then opt for plants in the window baskets that are going to be a seed source, as well as maybe a nectar source for hummingbirds. So it's just kind of looking at the constraints of your landscape, what you can have and what you can't have. And when choosing actual plants, choose the plants that are going to benefit the birds as opposed to those that don't do much. And the other thing too is, there are service projects as well within the community that, if you can't participate in these endeavors in your own space, you can certainly team up with people for service days and things like that. making even, public comment or something like that, on behalf of um, preserving habitat, you can still be a proponent um, for the birds, even if you're constrained with your own landscape.
One other thought I just had, Bruce, too, is if you decide to make those adjustments in the wintertime, is maybe add a bird feeder and some water and even some nest boxes that chickadees could huddle in for the wintertime. But adding those supplements could do could be really helpful for the birds that maybe are displaced while you're making those adjustments.
Yeah. Thanks, and a great talk. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for attending.
Yeah. Tweet.
All right. I'm putting a couple more links here for you guys from the chat. Does anyone else have any more questions? You can either raise your hand or put your name in the chat box. Let's see here. All right. All right. Well, Doug, any last thoughts about anything?
No, I mean, one of the questions that came up in Paulette gave a presentation a few weeks back that we talked a little bit about is how do you provide bird-friendly landscapes in the shade and in shaded environments? And we were talking about maybe building off of along the edges of your legacy trees, your upper canopy conifers, and providing some shrubs and getting those lower layers in around your conifer. The other thing that I had thought about after that discussion too was if you don't have a large yard and you don't have the ability to plant additional plants around it, would be to just put a feeder and a water bath, bird bath underneath the conifer, because you've got great cover there. And so you can just offer some supplemental feeding and water in those areas that can't sustain plants.
Yeah, there isn't a whole lot that will live underneath the canopy of a spruce tree, especially a large one that's been shedding those needles. It's a little bit different than, those old pine stands, where huckleberries and mosses and things are. It's a very specific microclimate, which is why they have been able to cultivate huckleberries, because you would have to pretty much recreate all those years of shedding pine needles and stuff. But I do sometimes like to kind of take a cue from native plants, So just because something's native doesn't mean it's native to a certain environment. So if you want to find native understory plants, right? You're not going to be looking necessarily, out on, on your way to Ringling, out Dry Creek. It's like, well, what grows there? There's certain grasses, there's that sunflower, there's Rocky Mountain juniper, and there's sagebrush. So different areas, different microclimates lend itself to different native plants. But yeah, adding something like that, you could even if you wanted to put some planters underneath it, if it's an area outside that you're looking at, you can put, things like whiskey barrels and stuff that you can certainly plant annual shade plants and things like herbaceous stuff, that would work too, because you're not relying on that soil that's just had needle shed over and over again. So
Yeah, that's a good idea.
okay, send out list of resources via email. Okay, yeah, we can certainly do that. I have everybody's email from signing up, and yeah, I can definitely follow up with an email with all the links here. So
the Montana Native Plant Society, that article, also, if you scroll down to the bottom of that article, has a wonderful resource list of both books and additional articles that are really helpful. So I'd recommend that as well. And then, you know, the Sacajawea Audubon, if you go to their site, you can not only get the brochure, but they've got a great presentation on landscaping for birds. So.
Okay, so I got a couple more questions. So when will our bare route be available? And will we be posting our bare route list for 2021 soon? Making your list. So we got our first truck in yesterday. We are still unpacking and sorting. One thing that I've said that I don't think we will be posting the list this year. That was mostly because of the COVID curbside last year. And so because we don't post a list until we know something's here and it's available. And so you can certainly call us and ask if something's come in yet. But I liken it to a grocery store almost, that we might have bananas right now, but we might, or the bananas haven't come in yet, but because of the turnover and the fact that it's a perishable product. But yes, we are starting to get those in. I would caution anybody because they have to be planted so, within 24, 48 hours. I know my soil, the first, 2 to 3 inches, I can work, but after that, it is a solid block of ice. And while you could take a pick out there and certainly pick at the ice, essentially what would happen is your roots would, I imagine what would kill it is lack of water, because the ground is frozen, so it can't actually get water. So yes, we are getting bare root in, that's trickling in now, but you got to make sure you're ready to plant first. All right, we got one more. I was told by a landscaper, okay, this was from Ben, that red twig dogwood was deer candy, and I have plenty of deer. Any suggestions? They do your pruning for you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they do graze on it. I had the red osier when I was living outside of town, and deer would come in and browse on it. I didn't really have a problem with it, but if you've got a lot of deer, that may be more of a deer management problem than a plant problem. It is hard, and I don't think this spring's going to be an issue, but there are deer resistant plants, but then there's also springs where if we have a hard winter in a spring, I've seen deer eat a lot of quote unquote deer resistant plants. And, so a lot of it just depends on what other food sources are available in that late winter, early springtime, which is a tough time for the deer. Yeah, I wouldn't stay away from it just because of deer. If that's what if you were trying to decide on the plant choice, I wouldn't, discourage you from that plant choice just because of the deer.
Okay, thanks, Doug. It's a deer management problem, to be sure.
Yes, how do we coexist? Yeah, so obviously deer resistant plants are not deer proof. And a couple years back, I saw them chew on blue spruce. They were so hungry that they were post holing, they could not forage down that type of snow we had. One thing, it depends the extent of the population there. If you've got one or two that kind of hang around, using a repellent is great, because then they don't, they come up, they decide they don't like it, or there's a repellent there, and so they don't associate that then with a food source. If you have a whole herd, that's different, because by the time the 50th one comes through to taste it and decide they don't like it, there's not much left. The other thing too is that dogwoods are, you can cut that thing down to the base, like lilacs, they call it rejuvenation pruning, and that thing will take off again. So the root systems that get established on things like that really allow it to bounce back quickly. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so let's see, from Meg. How do we
Yeah.
discourage magpies?
Yeah, magpies can be a one of your early morning alarm clocks for sure. I would say if you have the ability to disperse your food sources, particularly if you're worried that the magpies are dominating where your food sources are, if you can disperse them around your yard a little bit, spread it out a little bit more so the magpies can't be as dominant. They are nesting right now. You can prune your trees a little bit to make it a little more difficult for those nest sites to occur. It also reminds me of another species of bird that are the European house sparrow, which also is a dominant bird that we don't necessarily want to encourage in our yards. And the magpie and the sparrow are overwintering birds, and so they kind of get an early start on the nest sites that other birds don't get. And one of the things that I would always do is the males, particularly the sparrows, would be out doing their territorial calls, trying to attract mates. And generally, they would be doing it right where they wanted to nest. And so I would pay particular attention to those and kind of discourage them away from those areas. That would include, if you have a nest box, opening up the nest box. And it usually only takes about 24 hours, but I would open up my nest box, and just that lack of protection and cover that they would notice, they would move on to a different site. So again, sort of observe where they may be nesting, and also disperse your feeding sites a little bit, and that might help discourage the dominance that magpies will have.
All right. So I'm not seeing anything else here in the chat box. All right. Well, thanks again for joining, and thank you so much, Doug. This has been great.
Thank you,
I was
Emily.
anticipating such beautiful pictures in
Thank
that
you.
presentation, so that's just wonderful. But yeah, again, if anybody has any questions, we posted those links. I will follow up with an email for everyone, also providing those links. We do have printed copies of that landscape plan, landscaping for birds, that we collaborated on here at the nursery. And we'd be happy to help you choose plants that are appropriate for birds and whatever the space that you have. And again, yeah, consider reaching out to the Audubon Society, Sacajawea, and seeing how you can get involved with them as well. So, all right. Thanks again.
Thanks for everyone for attending. Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.